Greetings. My name is Mark Cruz. I'm an IT technician from Eagle River, Alaska, and I'm here today to celebrate passing another Microsoft exam. This one is called the AZ800 Administering Windows Server Hybrid Core Infrastructure. I'm celebrating by sharing some solid lab environments I made during my studies. I have shared the labs on my GitHub site. The link is in the description. These labs were designed to test the concepts of the exam material in an effort to reinforce learning. Before jumping into the labs, I wanted to provide some context to help make the labs just a bit more understandable. So it helps to use basic diagrams to explain some of these concepts. So in the 1980s, you started having personal computers show up at the office. So how these computers would get configured is the administrator would have to go to each computer and configure the networking information, maybe the computer name, file sharing permissions so that the computers can share files with each other. Then in the 90s, a company called Novell releases the concept of what we know today as a file server. And it's important because it's one of the first examples of centralization. So instead of having the files stored on more than one computer, you store all of the files on one server and then have the computers access those files on the file server. Around this time, Microsoft releases its product called NT and gives us the first example of a domain controller, which is essentially a server that is used to configure other servers. So this was all before the concept of what a domain is. So next I'm going to bring up a drawing of your standard Microsoft Active Directory domain services instance. And I'm just going to talk about each piece here. So in the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. So Windows 9 NT, which was released in the 90s, was the first Microsoft operating system that had domain controllers, but they're not the same kind of domain controllers that exist in Active Directory. So Active Directory domains are represented by a triangle. These here are the domain controllers, and they contain the Active Directory database. So if Active Directory domain services is being used, it means the domain is an on-premise domain. This technology is actually 26 years old now. So I'm going to focus here on the domain controllers. So the domain controller hosts the AD database, which contains objects, right? So these example objects would be computer objects, user objects, or group policy objects, which are settings that are applied to client machines. So a requirement for an on-premise ADDS domain is a name, and this is referred to as the domain name. So in this example, our domain name is megamooseforge.com. So all computers in the domain also have to have a name. So how this works is I would join a computer to the megamooseforge domain. Let's call it PC1. So after I join PC1 to the megamooseforge.com domain, its name would be pc1.megamooseforge.com. So next I want to talk about a critical service in ADDS, which is called the Domain Naming System. So its job is to associate IP address with computer names. So pc1.megamooseforge.com might have an IP address of 192 168.1.7, and that relationship is stored here on the DNS server. So if PC1 is looking, or excuse me, if PC2 is looking for PC1, it will reach out to the DNS server and say, hey, do you have an IP address for PC1? And the DNS server responds and says, yes, I do. PC2 then gets PC1's IP address from the DNS server. So in operation, all machines would register their computer names with the DNS server. And that illustrates that concept of centralization. Now, anytime another machine needs to find another machine, it can query the DNS database on the DNS server. So Microsoft has had a long-standing best practice to put two domain controllers in each physical location. This part of the reason is load balancing. So as the authentication requests are coming in, you can spread them out over two different servers, and then also for redundancy. So if a server goes down, domain controller goes down, the domain can still function with the remaining domain controller. A powerful and interesting thing about domain controllers is they replicate. So anytime I make a user account in the domain, it will replicate to the other domain controller. And so that's true for the computer objects and the group policy objects. These technologies allowed ADDS to do things like encrypting passwords for secure authentication. So the authentication protocol that is used is Kerberos. Before that, it was NTLM. And the directory services language is called LDAP. So this model that you see here in the triangle provides something very important, and it's centralization. So the industry began moving away from peer-to-peer networking, where each computer is kind of like its own boss, to an environment that is centrally managed with these domain controllers. So in an ADDS environment, you can use what's called a group policy object to configure the machine's settings and parameters from a central location. Any setting that can be configured on a Windows PC can be set using a group policy. So just for an example, in Server 2022, there were 4,442 settings that you can set in a group policy object. Some simple examples are disable wallpaper, set firewall rules. There's thousands of settings, and those group policy objects also replicate. So real quick, we just need to talk about how the internet fits into the domain. So before traffic leaves your domain, you want it to travel through a firewall. We don't want to expose our domain to the internet, so that is why we use the firewall. The firewall allows for traffic to flow securely in and out of the network. So eventually, employees wanted to work from home. So one technology that was developed over the last 20 years was virtual private networking. So this scenario is you need to access services that are behind the firewall when you are outside of the firewall. So what you should not do is just open up all the ports on the firewall and let all traffic through. So what we can do is use a RRAS server inside of the domain and then set up firewall rules to allow the traffic to flow from the internet through our firewall to our RRAS VPN server to make the virtual private network that will allow us to then access the resources inside of the domain when we are out in the internet. So the last piece I want to talk about is just a basic web server. So when you have an on-premise web server that you want to share out to the public, in order to do this, we would need to open all ports on the firewall, like specifically port 443, port 80, port 53. And this means that a hacker could very easily get into the network. So what we can do is put the web server on the other side of the firewall, put another firewall before it reaches the internet, and create what's known as a demilitarized zone or a perimeter network. So with this setup, we could allow ports 80 and 443 and 53 on the external firewall. So this would allow external traffic to make it to the web server, but the internal firewall would block all of the other ports and traffic. So what this picture represents is a traditional domain for the last 26 years, and this technology is known as ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. Another key foundation topic for the exam is virtualization, and specifically Hyper-V and containers. So this tech is known as the hypervisor, and it's been around since the 1970s, and it's fascinating. So over the last 15 to 20 years, a company called VMware developed this technology. So VMware kind of led the industry for years. So Hyper-V is Microsoft's implementation of the hypervisor, and it's included in almost every Windows OS, including the home versions. So what virtualization does is it emulates computer hardware. So I'm going to bring up an example. So this, I'm remoted into my Hyper-V host, and I've created this custom function that creates Hyper-V machines. So I'm going to open up the Hyper-V GUI. And what we'll see here shortly is the machine will create itself. So here is PC01. And then the function, it will start the VM here. So it will start up here. And so I've used a generalized image. I'll talk about that in the labs coming up. It allows me to get the computer to an up and running state just a bit faster. And so what you see here is this little program is pretending to be a computer to then launch the Windows operating system. So you can think of this as a computer within a computer, and that is what we know as virtualization. Sometimes it's just a bit slow on the first startup. And this is just the generalized image screen. Okay, and then we are here on our Hyper-V the virtual machine. And so this is a desktop. It looks like any other Windows desktop, but it is a virtual machine running on our Hyper-V host here. So quickly, I just wanted to illustrate the power of virtualization here in the diagram. So I'm just going to focus on these 4 servers in the example. So what virtualization allows me to do is use one powerful server to virtualize the 4 servers that I need. So right now, each of these servers is its own piece of hardware. But what we can do is stand up a Hyper-V host, virtualize the 4 servers within the one host. And now instead of having 4 pieces of hardware, we just have the one Hyper-V host that is then virtualizing the 4 servers. So now if I needed to add high availability to each server, I can stand up another Hyper-V host, virtualize all of those servers, and now I have 8 logical servers on 2 physical hosts. So this is one of the reasons that virtualization is so powerful. Another advantage is elasticity, and in the context of Hyper-V and virtualization, elasticity refers to the ability to dynamically adjust resources such as the CPU memory and storage to match fluctuating workload demands in real time. So another great thing about virtualization technologies is you can create what are known as checkpoints or snapshots, and this is a way to back up the server configuration, and it allows you to revert to a configuration state before the change was made. As virtualization became more standardized, Microsoft started thinking of ways to use their massive data centers. So they came up with a concept that will allow people to pay Microsoft to host their virtual machines in a Microsoft data center. So simply put, people can pay Microsoft to host their VMs rather than hosting it on an on-premises server. This is kind of the idea where cloud services came from. Cloud computing has different types of services. IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, PaaS, which is platform as a service, and SaaS, which is software as a service. So essentially anything you can host on-premise can now be hosted in the cloud. Amazon, Google, Intel, and Microsoft all offer cloud services. Cloud computing requires you to pay for what you use each month. So for the example, if you're using a VM, you're billed for how much CPU, memory, networking, and storage that you use each month to run that virtual machine. So here's just some simple definitions. IaaS, infrastructure as a service. You would rent a virtual machine like a server, storage, or networking in the cloud. You manage the OS apps and data, and the provider handles the physical stuff. So platform as a service, PaaS, is get a ready-to-use platform for building, running, and managing apps. So the provider handles the servers, the OS, and the runtimes, and you focus on your code and the data. It's kind of like renting a furnished apartment with the utilities, and you just live and work there. So software as a service, use fully managed software apps over the internet via subscription. So there's no maintenance. It's just you log in and go. Good example of that would be the Office suite. So briefly, I just want to talk about Entra ID, which is a good example of a platform as a service. So this is the directory service where user accounts, permissions, groups, and role permissions live. This is for the cloud environment. In an on-premise environment, we call it ADDS. So Microsoft 365 from the admin side is also considered platform as a service. But for example, Office for the web is software as a service. So Exchange Online and SharePoint Online are the same way where the user side is SaaS. So there are thousands of Azure services. So the AZ800 focuses on hybrid environments, and that's what this diagram represents. So hybrid here means running your Windows Server infrastructure as a smart mix of traditional on-premise servers, your own data center, your own hardware, and cloud-based services, all working together seamlessly. And so in this example, all of the services in the triangle are being combined with services offered from Azure. The AZ800 exam is the first of 2 exams required to earn the Microsoft Certified Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate certification. The full certification consists of the AZ800, Administering Windows Server Hybrid Core Infrastructure, which I have just cleared, and the AZ801, Configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. This is still to come. This is a role-based associate level certification. These do expire after 1 year from the date you earn the full certificate. So this is the main site for the certification, and they now have a warning that both the AZ800 and the AZ801 are scheduled to be retired on September 30th, 2026. The AZ800 and AZ801 will be replaced by the new AZ-802 exam. So the AZ-802 is expected to enter beta in June of 2026. So for now, you can continue to earn the Microsoft Certified Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate certification after the AZ800 and the AZ01 retire by passing this new AZ-802 exam. My plan is to get the AZ801 and then most likely recertify under the AZ-802. So this certification covers everything from deploying and managing Active Directory in on-premise and cloud environments, handling hybrid Windows Server workloads with Azure Arc, virtualization with Hyper-V containers, hybrid networking, storage, file services, and a whole host of other workloads. So the AZ800 is broken up into 5 different sections. So we'll go ahead and take a look here. So the first section is deploy and manage identity infrastructure. This is stuff like managing ADDS domain controllers and FSMO roles, implementing group policy objects, manage the advanced features of Active Directory domain services, implement hybrid identity with Windows Server, and deploy and manage Azure IaaS Active Directory domain controllers in the cloud. Next is manage Windows Server and workloads in a hybrid environment. This is stuff like perform Windows Server secure administration, describe Windows Server administration tools, perform post-installation configuration of Windows Server, administer and manage Windows Server IaaS virtual machines remotely, manage hybrid workloads with Azure Arc, and just enough administration in Windows Server known as JEA. So next we get into manage virtualization and containers in a hybrid environment. So this is stuff like configure and manage Hyper-V, configure and manage Hyper-V virtual machines, secure Hyper-V workloads, plan and deploy Windows Server IaaS virtual machines, customize Windows Server IIS virtual machines, automate the configuration of Windows Server cloud virtual machines, run containers on Windows Server, and orchestrate containers on Windows Server by using Kubernetes. Next, we get into implement and operate on-premise and hybrid networking infrastructure. This is stuff like implement DNS for Windows Server IaaS VMs, deploy and manage DHCP, implement Windows Server DNS, implement IP address management known as IPAM, implement remote access, implement hybrid network infrastructure, and implement Windows Server IaaS VM IP addressing and routing. And the final module is configure storage and file services. You do stuff like manage Windows Server file servers, implement storage spaces and storage spaces direct, implement Windows Server data deduplication, implement Windows Server iSCSI drives, implement Windows Server storage replica, and implement a hybrid file server infrastructure. So this is the Microsoft Learn curriculum. I also did a Udemy course and a college type textbook to prepare for the exam.